there's some discontent and some frustration going on at church these days, and I think it manifests itself in a variety of ways with different people. Certainly there's kind of this negative undertow. People express it as being not the way it used to be. There's blame, there's rumors, then there's spin control trying to contain the blame and the rumors, and then there's more blame and rumors about that. There's been people leaving membership, people leaving teams, leadership turnover, reduced financial giving, reduced giving in hours and talent. There has been a pastor who's left in the last year, and recently going back into negative cash flow position where we're not bringing in enough to cover the expenses going out the door. So all these things are of concern, and in some ways this is nothing new. Membership kind of waxing and waning over the years. It seems to have been going on far longer than I've been going to the church for the last 10 years. But yet in the last 2 years or so, it seems to have taken on a whole different quality. So the thing that's interesting is that it seems that everybody knows what the problem is. Really don't ever speak of the problem. We seem to talk around it a lot. We seem to imply that we all know what it is, that it's really fear-driven. I mean, the problem, what the cause is, what the solution is, what the root cause is, all these things get commingled with symptoms and feelings and emotion and facts and innuendo, and all this kind of balls up into this mess that people are saying that someone should do something about it, but yet when it comes right down to holding somebody accountable, if it doesn't happen. So why is this so important to me? Why am I putting so much time into this? For several reasons. One, I've put in about 9 years and have done some things that I think have been groundbreaking, and in the last 2 years it has been undone. It's been this downward spiral for about 2 years, and there just really doesn't seem to be a bottom to how far this goes down. Robin, when she left, her last sermon was about doing like target shooting with clay pigeons, and talking about just like shooting them out of the sky one after another in terms of just things that she's heard or people have said that are just based on rumors or simply false, and she just felt like just shooting these off one after another, kind of knocking off all this stuff. And I think that would be exactly my sentiments towards all of this, but there's really not a place to do that. It would be nice just to put them out there in terms of either setting the record straight or at least getting the conversation started to set the record straight on some things, because it's really difficult to move forward or to build on anything that I have done or other people have done when there is just false assumptions, there's misunderstandings, and there's presumptions that are just simply not true. A second reason is that I think people are being genuinely hurt. Certainly there's been misunderstandings, there's been hurt feelings, there's been people who've left over the years, but I think that is different than what's been going on the past 2 years. I think there has been genuine damage done in terms of some of the control that has been going. The third one is that I think in the last month or two we're seeing real risk of the church simply imploding. Last summer when the denomination came in, I think that was a turning point for me, because they had articulated several things that were obvious to me from the previous year, and I thought that was really the chance to have things start turning around from an outside influence who really understood kind of the systems at play here and how to go about changing that. But over the last 6 months since then, we have just played right into the hands of the self-defeating downward spiral as an organization as we try to help ourselves, which is to be expected in a situation like this. But nonetheless, we are starting to put into policy movements that have just profound dysfunction at their core, but yet we're taking them as facts. Unless things turn around in a profound way and in a disruptive way, the church is really at risk of just simply not being here anymore. The disturbing part is that the more we help ourselves without looking at this from a systems standpoint, is the more that we're going to ensure that kind of implosion occurs. And then fourthly, I think, and this is the big one for me, and this is that the organization is completely paralyzed to do what we are supposed to be doing. Our mission statement in terms of reaching out to people who are in need, people who are hurting, people who are isolated, we're not doing much about that. We certainly have our transition to a more programmed church. We are financially, organizationally, spiritually, and motivationally paralyzed. As long as we are focused inward, as long as we are focused on ourselves, and as long as we have this self-defeating behavior that we don't really even know that we have until we can step back far enough to see the forest for the trees, to see what's going on. We're simply just going to consume ourselves. It used to be we just couldn't get out of our own way in order to do good, but I think at this point, and there's really not a whole lot of hope of being able to help anybody else when we're in this kind of mode, and we need to get out of it to where I'm willing to do a fair amount of turning over of tables, so to speak, and I think that that's what has to happen. Is you need to get to a point where people are willing to do out of the ordinary radical things as opposed to applying the same techniques, the same linear thinking that we always have. So I think one way to look at this is through example, but we have to be careful because when we give examples, then we start talking about blame, because that's the first thing that we ascribe to it. Is if you're talking about someone or something, then that means we must be blaming, and then we shut the person off. And that kind of makes sense, but it's really difficult to establish any kind of credibility for a pattern of behavior, because that's really what is going on here, without using examples. And that's the first thing people ask for is examples. But if you give them examples, then you get shut down because you gave an example, which is blaming. So you can't get out of that trap, and I understand the trap, but we need to get over that and get through this and realize that that's just part of the semantic game, the stronghold and the fear at play that's keeping us from moving forward. That doesn't mean we stop there. That means that that's simply a construct that's in the organization that prevents it from ever doing any kind of self-examination. And that's the unfortunate part, because I think that once you get through that, you're going to find that it's a shell game. There's not a whole lot there other than fear itself. The blame thing starts collapsing pretty quickly, at least on my analysis, because it's like a pendulum going back and forth, where it may seem like blame, but then it goes the opposite direction, then goes the opposite direction, and after about 6 oscillations back and forth, you realize how ridiculous this is, that it is simply an obstructionist construct and not really anything directly to do with blame, but because its label is blame, it is very powerful. So what I would like to do is just look at how operationally some things have played out over the last 2 years, just to give an example of tangible things in the sense of not just people having conversation, but how the organization has become paralyzed, and why people would feel frustrated, and why people would leave, and why there's been reduced cash flow, things like that. I'd like to just take a look at how a simple process of installing a light switch, let's just say that for example, plays out over the last 2 years in the organization, and how obstructionist it becomes. So we're going to start off with, like for example, my team, the tech team, we want to put in a light switch, let's say. And to do that, it's kind of a technical thing, so you have a variety of steps that we're going to go through. We'd go out and find where the light switch is going to be, how it's going to function. We have to go buy it, install it, test it, those kinds of things. So those are the kind of the technical tasks that are involved, and I think that's where we tend to always focus. But that part, I think we're pretty confident we get that. That's not really where a problem exists, but that's where everything starts, as we're trying to accomplish something. So in this case, my team is trying to accomplish installing this light switch, but at some point you have a step in here that is collaborative in nature. So let's say we need to figure out where to install it. Like, is it going to go on in the wall? Is it going to go on a surface mount? Where would be the place to go? Well, clearly that's not a technology thing. That's something that interfaces with the building. So it involves another team. And there is this construct over the years that says that it's better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission. And I can understand that, given kind of the fear-based obstructionist stuff I'm going to describe, but that's really no way to run an organization. You need to work with the processes that are already in place. And in this case, there's going to be a process for doing this collaboration with another team. It's going to say, I want to be able to install this. We have to work through that process. There's not going to be a process probably exactly saying how to install a light switch, but it's going to be the process of how 2 teams work together and come to a plan in terms of who does the work, who pays for it, when it gets done, things of that nature. One of the things that I did 2 years ago was try to really work through that process for 2 reasons. One is that I simply got tired of doing the do it and then ask for forgiveness. I think that's just a childish organization busting type of mindset to have, so I wanted to break through that. And second of all is I was fairly well aware that I was going to run into some resistance and I wanted that resistance to become clear so that we could have some accountability. And if it's my team's responsibility, then I need to step up to the plate and take care of that. But if it's someone else's responsibility, then likewise they need to take care of that, and then we need to look at the consequences that come out of that and get rid of some of this murky area. And I think that that's been going on for years and years and years, and it seemed like it just needed to be shored up. And that level 1 process would be the way that we collaborate with the other team in determining where this particular light switch would go. And that usually involve a meeting, some kind of policy that they would clarify and tell us what that is that we need to work through, and so on and so forth. Then there may be another step out here where we need to actually install it, and we need to know, is that something that we do ourselves? Do we need to hire a contractor? What are those criteria? So we would certainly want to know what that process is, or what that policy is, perhaps in this place, just so we can have clarification. So far so good. At level 1, this is that collaborative process, and what we found is a couple of things would happen. One is it didn't fit. This process up here may sound good on paper or in a conference room, but it didn't play out in terms of the reality of what our team was experiencing. An example would be, let's say that they have a process up here, and this is purely hypothetical, but let's say there's a process where anything that you need to purchase needs to be approved at like a Monday at noon type of meeting. And then let's say that the device that failed is over the weekend, like on a Saturday, and we need to have it for church on Sunday. And if the process says we need to take it to this committee to be reviewed on Monday at noon, that sounds pretty good, but that doesn't get us that device replaced by Sunday morning. So there would need to be a process that's more accommodating, saying that there needs to be an emergency path that goes around that, or there needs to be a less onerous process here or something, because otherwise that leaves us between a rock and a hard place, where either we have to wait until Monday and then not fulfill what we're trying to do on Sunday at service, which is really core to what we're all here about, so that's not something that's very palatable to us, or we need to go back to the old school where we ask for forgiveness and don't ask for permission. So we would just go ahead and do it, and then come Monday we'd say, well, we've already made that decision, and then we would probably be forgiven and we would just move forward. But that doesn't really help anybody. So there isn't a solution in that case if we want to both be collaborative and follow the process, and the process doesn't fit the reality. And that's a big gap for us, because that happens a lot, especially with things that are critical for service timing, where it simply has to work, and it has to work by 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. The way that is normally dealt with is by moving to a process for improving the processes. So there would usually be within here some type of process over here that says, all right, that didn't work out, so that particular time either we didn't have it for Sunday or we worked around the process, one of the two. But then we would go back and say, at that meeting we would talk about the fact that we already purchased the item, and then there would be some accountability at that point in a normal, healthy organization. And then we would say, well, there's no other choice, we had to do something. And they'd say, oh, that's unfortunate, don't do that again. Now, let's come up with an improved process that can take care of that. And then the organization as a whole, or the organization that's responsible for this process, takes responsibility for that gap. And they have to either say, well, we need to accommodate that, or we need to live with the consequence of not having something perhaps for Sunday service, because the waiting till Monday is more important. It doesn't really matter to us. We just need to have that clear so that there's a path that meets reality. The process is broken, not the people or the actual technical part of it down here. In this case, that is not what happened. We actually went to another level. We now have a process that needs to discuss this gap as a performance issue, that basically denying that the gap exists between paper and reality, and saying that it's more of a people problem. So this is where the blame starts, where we say we're not blaming people, but the problem is not a defective process or a defective system. It is that someone didn't follow the rules. So now we come up here to another abstraction that is a process of meetings and discussions and essentially diversions to discuss this whole thing. And this becomes obstructionist. At this point, it seems like it's a productive process. It seems like it's this, but it isn't, because the focus is not on changing the process. The focus is on changing the people. In other words, in my case, I was looking for a process here that was simpler. I just wanted to know, for example, clarification of policy. What has already been written? I just want to know, is it this way or that way? And it turned out to be a collaborative process, which was okay for a while, but I still wasn't getting my answer. So then it became this obstructionist process, as opposed to just saying, I deserved my answer. What I was asking for is a way to streamline the work down here, and we just want to know what the policy is, and then we'll work with that. But that the focus got very confused, because the focus should have been on process improvement. This is the road we start going down, where we have non-technical people discussing technical things, when really people need to focus on their own domains. If this process is yours, then you need to take ownership for that process. If this technical part is your technical thing, then you need to stay focused on the technical. And if there's a gap, then this process improvement needs to come in and take play. But what really happens at this level 2 is that we think we're working on this, but what we really are doing is just having this obstructionist series of meetings and discussions and diversions that talk about this stuff, which is very strange to me, because all of a sudden you have leadership, senior leadership, discussing technical tasks of how to wire something up when that has nothing to do with it. So this becomes a Trojan horse or a shell game that serves really no purpose other than to obstruct. As you get into that, you discover that there's really a deeper level going on here. There's a culture going on. There's hidden agendas. There's long-term misunderstandings, kind of like a family feud that has been going on for so many generations that people don't even remember what the topic even is anymore, but it's still alive and well. So there's this undertow culture going on of command and control and blame and shame. And those are the unspoken things, but they become very real as you keep going deeper into this and not backing off. You were supposed to back off here, and that's what the culture wanted you to do, is to not break this, because this is essentially status quo, what we're talking about. So by challenging the status quo, by crossing this line, you start getting obstructionist behavior. And this line in the sand becomes more rigid as you get closer to actually challenging it and taking it on for what it's worth, and taking the focus off the technical, taking the focus off the process, and saying this is about obstruction and about not meeting our mission statement and our goals. Then this line becomes very hard when you realize that you're encountering a culture that is insurmountable. And that's really what this is all about. This line has either not been crossed very often over the years, or it has been such a hidden and defined line that nobody dares go near it, because of the fear and the misinformation and the spin around this obstructionist stuff is so entrenched into the culture that we don't even know that we're doing it to ourselves. The status quo is extremely powerful. In a sense, what all this becomes is a riddle. It doesn't have an answer to it. There is no solution. It's circular in nature. It points back to the person who ever started this process. We're calling that blame by blaming the person, and that's a riddle. It's obstructionist. It has no solution. Cause and effect are backwards, and certainly the intent behind all this has nothing to do with helping people. So what's going on? How do we name this? I think the most powerful thing is a story that shows the circumstances, the people, the policy, the environment, the interactions, that shows all of that. And I think that story becomes a very compelling way to communicate what the problem is about, particularly if you have many stories all overlaying each other with the same underlying theme. There's several forces at work. I think there's misinformation. There is an organization chart over the last 2 years that feeds back on itself, that we have been strongly warned about in past reports from outside consultants, that we need to be very concerned about conflict of interest that breeds this type of thing. We have a lack of scientific problem solving skills. We don't understand root cause. We get cause and effect reversed quite often. We have false assumptions. Virtually every decision over the last 2 years has been heavily influenced by personality, and they're all kind of peaking at the same time over the last 2 years. So we've really transitioned into something that has become the 10,000-pound elephant. And I would name two things that characterize the 10,000-pound elephant. One is that it has become what I'm going to call a wicked problem. And a wicked problem is one that can't be solved by ordinary linear thinking or traditional thinking. In other words, A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D would be a linear thinking process, or taking a big problem and breaking it down into components and then making decisions based on those smaller granular views, and then thinking that's going to somehow map out to the bigger picture. Those types of techniques don't work with wicked problems. Wicked problems are things like global warming, where it's a self-inflicted problem, and the people who are trying to do something about it are in effect making the problem worse, or further entrenching the problem, at least making it that much more unsolvable. And the very people who have the best chance at turning the situation around and can actually fix the problem are also the people who cause the problem, but they're wholly unaware of the fact that the problem exists and certainly don't know that they have the solution. So it becomes this conundrum. It's not just something that you look at as a thing and then you work on the problem. It becomes a systemic problem. And that's why systems theory is so important in this, and why it's going to be really critical to understand some basic concepts of systems thinking in order to look at what the possible solutions are, or even what more of an explanation can be given for what is going on to describe the wicked problem itself. And that means that it's not so much the people or the things, but it's the verbs, it's the process, it's the way we think, it's the culture, it's the word choices that we make, it's the environment. All of these things come into play. The circumstances are everything. That's what makes for a wicked problem. So that when you look at it in a conference room, it seems like a fairly solvable problem. And then we apply linear problem solving techniques to it, and then go out into the world and implement it, and it backfires. And that's because the problem never was with the people or with the things. We don't talk about the process outside of people and things. And you intermix that with misinformation and layer upon layer upon layer of assumptions over the years, and things that just never get talked about. And then you make decisions in a command and control type culture where you use linear thinking of nouns, objects, things, people, and then set policy and procedure that then gets passed down into a real world that has the wicked problem that exists not with the people and the things, but with the stuff in between. And then it doesn't work, but then we don't have any way of feeding that back to then correct itself, so we just assume that it's a compliance issue, and then we apply more command and control, and indirectly we are applying enormous amounts of blame and shame, although we never say it, because if it's not said, then it must not be blame and shame. But it is blame and shame. And that's where we come to the second area. What has spawned is something that's truly disturbing, and that is a cycle of abuse. Command and control, the blame and the shame, is being turned against people, and we are denying it. It becomes an abuse cycle, and that's exactly what it is, and it's time that we name it. The name for this is workplace bullying. And the second part of that is organizational bullying. Workplace bullying is really people upon people, and the organizational bullying becomes an institutionalization of that workplace bullying, where we as an organization accept and codify into policy and thinking that it is a positive way to inflict accountability and financial stability and operational stability, when it is doing the opposite of that, and the byproduct is that it is bullying behavior to people, and it is going to destroy the organization and the people in it if something is not done about it very soon. That wicked problem combined with this abuse cycle, and we've got a recipe for disaster, and that's exactly what we have on our hands here. This is the elephant that is in the room. I can't draw an elephant. What do we do about this, and how do we get into the more specifics of it? I have plenty of more material, but I'm hoping that this is enough to whet your appetite to where we can take it to the next level. It's very important that we don't jump to any conclusions. I didn't say people's names for a reason. It's not because I'm a coward. It's because they're irrelevant. We focus on people. We are missing the point. We cannot distract ourselves by saying that we're going to look for a thing or a person to blame in a singular nature, because we're just going to repeat the cycle again and again and again.